that would make a dog stand in the middle of a highway, refusing to move? Welcome back to my YouTube channel, where I bring you emotional, heartwarming, and mysterious stories of dogs, tales of loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bond between humans and their four-legged companions. Dog Face. In today's story, we follow a man whose ordinary drive home takes an unexpected turn when a German Shepherd blocks his path, not by accident, but with purpose. What follows is a journey of mystery, discovery, and an emotional connection that neither of them saw coming. Now, let's dive into the story. Danny Hayes' foot slammed the brake as his truck lurched to a stop. His heartbeat skipped. His fingers flexed against the wheel. There, in the fading light of dusk, stood a German Shepherd. Unmoving. Unfazed. As if the entire world had paused around it. Danny's hands clenched the steering wheel. Behind him, cars began to honk impatiently, their drivers leaning out, yelling at him to move. He should. But he couldn't. The dog's posture wasn't that of a confused stray darting between lanes or a frightened pet looking for its owner. No, this one stood firm, rooted in place like it had a mission. Not lost. Not scared. Not running. Just waiting. Another car swerved around him, tires skidding dangerously close to the dog. Still, it didn't flinch. Danny's breath came slow and measured. His gut whispered that this was no ordinary encounter. The shepherd turned its head, locking eyes with him. A silent message. Not desperate. Not panicked. Calling. Then, with a final glance, it turned and trotted down the road. Not running. Not fleeing. Leading. Danny sat frozen, watching the dog move with deliberate purpose. The cars behind him veered past, their red taillights disappearing into the distance. He should just drive away. Instead, he threw the truck in park, killed the engine, and stepped out. And as if it had been waiting for him to make that choice. The shepherd looked back. And kept going. Danny stood beside his truck, the cool evening air pressing against his skin. The German Shepherd had already turned away, trotting down the empty stretch of highway. It didn't hesitate. Didn't look lost. Didn't waver in its steps. But then, it glanced back. A quick flick of its head, amber eyes locking onto Danny's. A look that wasn't fearful, wasn't pleading. It was expectant. Danny exhaled slowly, running a hand through his unkempt hair. What am I doing? He had places to be. A life to get back to. The kind that didn't involve chasing after strange dogs on darkening roads. Another car zoomed past, its tires hissing against the pavement, driver barely sparing the scene a glance. To them, this was nothing, a stray, a minor inconvenience, a fleeting moment they'd forget by the time they got home. But Danny? He couldn't shake the feeling that this was something more. Something that demanded his attention. His fingers twitched by his side. He should just get back in his truck. Drive off. Forget this ever happened. But the dog. It stopped again, farther down the road now, but still watching him. Waiting. And that was it. With a sharp inhale, Danny shoved his keys into his pocket and took the first step forward. The shepherd's ears perked. Then, without a sound, it continued moving. And Danny followed. The soft crunch of gravel faded beneath Danny's boots as he left the highway behind, trailing the German Shepherd toward the tree line. The last slivers of daylight stretched across the sky, bleeding into deep shades of indigo and gold. The hum of distant traffic grew fainter with each step, swallowed by the dense silence of the forest ahead. Danny hesitated at the edge of the woods. The trees loomed tall, their branches woven into a tangled canopy that let in only traces of the dying light. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, the kind of deep, untouched wilderness that felt ancient, forgotten. The shepherd didn't stop. It slipped through the underbrush with practiced ease, navigating the uneven ground like it had done this 1,000 times before. Its tail was low but steady, its head forward, ears flicking at the distant sounds of the woods. Not lost. Not wandering. It knew exactly where it was going. Danny exhaled, his breath misting in the cooling air. This was insane. Following a strange dog into the woods, no explanation, no sense of where this would lead. He should turn back. And yet, his feet moved forward on their own. Leaves crackled under his weight. A light breeze stirred the branches above, whispering through the trees like a voice he couldn't quite make out. Crickets had started their evening chorus, but beyond that, the world felt too quiet. Danny's eyes tracked the dog's movements. It moved with purpose, urgent, but not frantic. There was no hesitation in its steps, no uncertainty. What was it looking for? A cold prickle crawled up Danny's spine as a realization settled in his gut. The shepherd wasn't searching for something. It was leading him to it. Danny followed the shepherd deeper into the forest, his steps careful over the uneven ground. The path, if there even was one, was nothing more than damp earth, twisted roots, and scattered leaves. The farther they went, the more he questioned himself. What am I doing? But before he could entertain the thought of turning back, the dog stopped. Dead still. Danny nearly stumbled, catching himself against a tree. The shepherd stood rigid, ears pricked, body tense. Its head was slightly lowered, eyes locked on something ahead. Danny's gaze followed. At first, he saw nothing but the darkened forest floor. Then his eyes adjusted, picking up something unnatural among the undergrowth, a pile of scattered branches, almost like something had been hastily covered. A gust of wind rustled the leaves overhead. The air felt colder now. Then, a sound. Faint. Barely audible beneath the whisper of the trees. A whimper. Danny's chest tightened. He took a hesitant step forward. The shepherd didn't move, only watched. His hands reached for the branches, fingers curling around the damp wood. Slowly, carefully, he brushed them aside. And then, he saw it. A tiny, trembling puppy, curled up beneath the debris. Its fur was matted, ribs faintly visible beneath its fragile frame. Wide, frightened eyes peered up at him, its tiny body shivering. Danny felt something in him shift. A weight in his chest, something old, something he'd buried long ago. This was why the dog had stopped traffic. Not for itself. For this. The shepherd took a step closer, lowering its head to nudge the puppy gently with its nose. A silent confirmation. Danny swallowed hard, exhaling through his nose. Slowly, he reached out, hands steady despite the storm brewing in his chest. The puppy flinched, but it was too weak to resist. It didn't fight. Didn't run. It just let itself be held. For the first time in a long time, Danny felt something unfamiliar creep into his guarded heart. A responsibility. A purpose. Something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. And just like that, the choice was made. He wasn't leaving without them. Danny cradled the tiny puppy against his chest, its frail body barely heavier than a breath. It shivered violently, burrowing instinctively into the warmth of his jacket. The German shepherd stepped forward, sniffing the puppy once before looking up at Danny, a silent acknowledgement. You found it. Now what? The question pressed into his mind as he exhaled, steadying himself. Now what? The highway felt miles away, the memory of his truck distant. Yet, there was no hesitation in his steps as he turned back, retracing the path through the trees. The shepherd followed. Not ahead this time. Not leading. Just walking beside him. Every few steps, Danny glanced down at the German shepherd, watching the way it never took its eyes off the puppy. Was this its pup? The idea felt impossible. There was no resemblance. But still, something about the way it hovered close, the way it remained on edge, watching Danny's every move, made him wonder. Parent? Guardian? Or something more? His boots crunched over fallen leaves, the whisper of the forest pressing in around them. The puppy stirred weakly in his arms, letting out a soft whimper. Danny tightened his grip slightly, his own thoughts gnawing at him now. What am I supposed to do with this? He wasn't a dog person. He wasn't even a people person. He could take it to a shelter. There had to be one nearby. Someone trained, someone responsible, someone who actually knew what they were doing. That was the logical choice. But then, he glanced at the shepherd. The dog was still watching him. Not just the way dogs do. Deeper. Knowing. Waiting. Danny looked down at the small ball of fur against his chest. It barely moved, its tiny paws curled in exhaustion. A lump formed in his throat, an old buried ache surfacing in his chest. He forced it down. One thing at a time. Reaching the tree line, he spotted his truck just ahead. The road stretched empty now, quiet beneath the moonlight. He took a breath. Shelter. Home. He still had time to decide. But as he opened the truck door, something told him. This wasn't just a choice. It was a turning point. Danny sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the two dogs beside him. The shepherd had settled on the floor of the passenger side, its sharp amber eyes never leaving the tiny, shivering bundle wrapped in Danny's jacket. Every few seconds it would shift, lean in, nudge the pup with its nose, checking, reassuring, watching. Danny exhaled, shaking his head. Just for the night. That's what he told himself as he turned the key in the ignition. Just long enough to warm the little guy up, maybe get some food in him. Tomorrow, he'd figure it out, call a shelter, find someone more equipped for this. Because he wasn't that person. Not anymore. The cabin was dark when he pulled into the driveway, the glow from the porch light casting long shadows across the yard. It wasn't much, just a quiet place on the outskirts of town, tucked away between stretches of open fields and trees. A place for someone who didn't want to be found. He carried the puppy inside carefully, the shepherd trailing close behind, its nails tapping softly against the wooden floor. Danny hesitated as he reached the couch. What the hell was he even supposed to do now? He didn't exactly keep dog food around. With a sigh, he grabbed an old blanket from the closet, folded it into a makeshift bed, and set the puppy down gently. It barely stirred. The shepherd immediately curled up beside it, placing its muzzle over the pup as if shielding it from the cold. Danny watched. Something about the way the shepherd moved, so deliberate, so certain, unnerved him. It was too aware. Too much like it understood more than it should. This isn't just a stray. But what was it then? He pushed the thought aside and busied himself in the kitchen, finding a can of plain chicken soup. It wasn't much, but it was something. He spooned out the softest bits, set a bowl on the floor, and watched as the shepherd ate sparingly before nudging what was left toward the puppy. Danny swallowed. Yeah, you're not attached at all, he muttered. The shepherd looked at him. Not a normal look. Not just a glance. It was something deeper. Danny turned away. He was imagining things. He tossed his jacket over a chair, rubbing the back of his neck. His shoulders ached, a familiar, dull weight. It had been years. Years since he'd let anything, or anyone, too close. People used to tell him time heals all wounds. They were wrong. Time didn't heal anything. It just made you better at pretending. He shook the thoughts from his head and grabbed a chair, dragging it beside the couch. The fireplace crackled, filling the room with warmth. He wasn't sure why, but he didn't want to leave them alone. The shepherd's head rested protectively over the pup. The little one let out a soft sigh, its tiny body finally relaxed. Danny leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Just for the night. Yeah. He didn't believe that either. Morning light filtered through the cabin windows, casting a golden glow across the wooden floors. Danny sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in his hands, his gaze fixed on the two dogs curled up by the fireplace. The puppy had finally stopped trembling, its tiny chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. The shepherd lay beside it, eyes half closed but still alert, as if on constant guard. Danny rubbed his jaw, his mind turning over a question he couldn't ignore anymore. Who are you? Because this dog, this shepherd, was not just a stray. Danny had been around enough dogs in his life to know the difference. Strays had a certain wildness, a constant unease, always ready to run. But this one? It was calm. Observant. Too controlled to be feral. And the way it had led him straight to the puppy. Danny leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He needed answers. By mid-morning, Danny found himself staring at his old, dust-covered laptop. It had been ages since he had any real reason to use it, but now he was typing into a search bar, scrolling through local lost dog reports. Nothing. No German shepherds matching this one's description. He expanded the search to neighboring towns. Still nothing. No missing posters. No online pleas from desperate owners. Nothing at all. He frowned. How could a dog like this have no past? A few hours later, Danny parked outside a small veterinary clinic on the edge of town. He had called ahead, explaining he had a stray shepherd that he needed checked for a microchip. The receptionist had sounded cheerful, too cheerful, and that only made him more reluctant. He didn't do small talk. Still, he carried the puppy inside, the shepherd trotting beside him, moving through the space like it had been here before. The vet, a woman in her early 50s with kind eyes, greeted them with a warm smile. "Well, you're a handsome one," she murmured, crouching in front of the shepherd. The dog stood still, allowing her inspection without so much as a flinch. Danny watched, arms crossed. "Doesn't act like a stray." The vet hummed in agreement, running a handheld scanner along the shepherd's neck. Danny held his breath. A second passed. Then another. The scanner beeped once. Then went silent. The vet straightened, shaking her head. "No chip. No ID." Danny's fingers flexed against his arms. "So, no owner?" "Not necessarily," she said. "But if this dog belonged to someone, there's no way to trace it." Danny nodded, staring at the shepherd, who was now watching him. That was it then. No past. No records. Just a dog who had appeared out of nowhere, leading him to something he never would have found on his own. Danny drove home in silence. The puppy was curled up on the passenger seat, the shepherd sitting beside it on the floor, calm as ever. No microchip. No owner. No ties to anywhere. The thought settled in his chest, heavier than it should have. Because, for the first time since this all started, the idea of keeping them didn't feel crazy. Didn't feel temporary. Didn't feel like a mistake. It just felt right. Days passed, and the rhythm of life at the cabin began to shift. The puppy was stronger now. No longer the frail, trembling creature Danny had pulled from the forest floor. It had started to stumble after the shepherd in wobbly, determined steps, clinging to its protector like a shadow. And the shepherd? It never left its side. Danny watched the way it hovered, always aware, always one step ahead. The silent guardian. The unspoken protector. And maybe, Danny realized, his, too. It was during an early morning walk, the kind Danny had started taking just to clear his head, when it happened. The shepherd stopped. Not gradually. Not lazily. It froze. Danny almost walked right past before he noticed the sudden shift, the dog's entire body rigid, ears perked, muscles locked like coiled steel. The last time it had done this, Danny had ended up in the woods, digging a near-lifeless puppy from beneath a pile of debris. His gut tightened. "Not again," he muttered. But the shepherd had already started moving. Danny followed, just like before. The forest thickened around them, branches weaving overhead, swallowing what little light seeped through the trees. The earth was damp beneath his boots, the air rich with the scent of moss and pine. The shepherd's pace never faltered. Not once. Not even when the underbrush grew tangled, when the path thinned to nothing but uneven ground and shadows. Danny exhaled, pushing past the tangle of low-hanging branches. "Where are you taking me this time?" The dog didn't answer. But soon Danny saw it. Something buried beneath the loose earth and fallen leaves. A backpack. Danny crouched, brushing away the dirt, revealing the faded, torn fabric of the bag. The zippers were rusted. The straps frayed. Whoever had left it here, it had been a long time ago. He hesitated before pulling it open. Inside, he found a wallet. Old ID cards. A few personal belongings, a key, a lighter, a crumpled map. Then, at the bottom, something cold and metallic. Danny's fingers curled around it, pulling it free. His breath hitched. A dog tag. The name was barely legible, worn with time. The edges were scratched, dulled by age. He turned it over, his pulse drumming in his ears. This wasn't just some abandoned hiker's bag. This belonged to someone. Someone who never came back. And the shepherd, watching, waiting, knowing, had led him straight to it. Back at the cabin, Danny placed the dog tag and wallet on the kitchen table, staring at them like they might somehow explain themselves. The name on the ID was faded, the ink smudged by time and exposure. But it was still readable. Michael Turner. Danny leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. The name meant nothing to him. At least, not yet. He searched online, scrolling through missing persons reports, local news archives, any scrap of information he could find. It took time, but eventually, he found it. A missing hiker's case. Michael Turner. Disappeared over 5 years ago. Last seen near the outskirts of town, heading into the woods. Never found. Danny's breath came slow and measured as he stared at the grainy photo of the man. Who had he been? What had happened to him? And more importantly, why had the shepherd led him to his belongings? Danny wasn't the type to call the cops. He'd spent too many years avoiding attention, keeping his head down, letting the world move on without him. But this was different. The phone rang twice before a clipped voice answered. Sheriff's Department. Danny kept it short. I think I found something connected to a missing person. A hiker, Michael Turner. There was a pause. Then, you have evidence? A backpack. His ID. A dog tag. Another pause. Then a sigh. Turner's case is old. No real leads. You sure about this? Danny glanced at the shepherd, lying near the fireplace, amber eyes fixed on him like it was waiting for his next move. Yeah, he muttered. I'm sure. The sheriff said they'd send someone out to take a look, but Danny could hear the doubt in their voice. 5 years was a long time. Missing hikers were common. If they hadn't found the guy by now, they probably weren't expecting to. Danny set the phone down and exhaled. Something about this, about all of it, felt too familiar. A lost person. An abandoned place. A story that never got its ending. Flashbacks stirred in his mind. A woman's voice. A name he hadn't said aloud in years. A night spent staring at a police report, knowing it would never be enough. He closed his eyes briefly, pushing it back, locking it away. The past had a way of pulling you under if you let it. And he'd spent too long keeping his head above water. But the shepherd, it knew. It watched him like it had seen ghosts before. Like it was waiting for him to see them too. Danny wasn't the kind of man who chased ghosts. But after finding the backpack, the ID, the dog tag, and making the call to the sheriff, something inside him refused to let it go. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something deeper. Heavier. Personal. And the shepherd? It wasn't done yet. Danny had spent the morning piecing together the last known movements of Michael Turner. According to the few remaining records, Turner had been an avid hiker, always venturing deep into the wilderness. The last place he had been spotted was a trailhead just outside of town. Danny traced the route, walking the same path, scanning the overgrown landscape for anything that didn't belong. And the shepherd led the way. It didn't hesitate, didn't need prompting. Like it had walked this path before. Like it already knew where they were going. Hours passed. The forest grew denser, darker, quieter. Then Danny saw it. Hidden beneath a canopy of trees, nearly swallowed by the wilderness, stood an old cabin. It was falling apart, wood warped from years of neglect, windows shattered, the porch half collapsed. No signs of life. Just a place time had abandoned. Danny felt a chill crawl up his spine. The shepherd stopped at the threshold, tail low, ears twitching. It had led him here for a reason. Danny swallowed and stepped inside. Dust coated the air, swirling in the dim light that seeped through the cracks in the walls. Everything was still, untouched, like whoever had once lived here had simply vanished. Danny's boots creaked against the wooden floor as he scanned the room. A rusted stove. A few broken chairs. A table covered in papers, yellowed with age. And then, he saw them. Photographs. Faded, curled at the edges, tucked into a cracked frame on the mantel. Danny picked one up, brushing away the dust with his thumb. A man in his late 30s, smiling beneath a worn-out cap. Beside him, standing proudly on a rocky ridge, a German shepherd. Danny's heart stopped. He looked down at the dog beside him. The same piercing amber eyes. The same strong build. The same damn dog. Danny exhaled, his grip on the photograph tightening. It couldn't be. A dog didn't live for years out in the wild, waiting, searching. Did it? The shepherd watched him now, as if waiting for him to understand. Danny's mind reeled. If this dog had once belonged to Michael Turner, then that meant it had been out here, alone, for years. Surviving. Searching. Leading him here, And now, Danny was the one left standing at the crossroads. What the hell was he supposed to do with that? The cabin was no longer just a forgotten relic, it was a crime scene now. By the next morning, authorities had arrived. The sheriff, a couple of deputies, and a forensic team combed through the decayed structure, dusting off remnants of a life that had been abandoned too soon. Danny stood at a distance, arms crossed, watching. He had told them everything, the shepherd leading him here, the backpack, the ID, the dog tag. He kept his voice steady, detached, like this was just another story in the news. But it wasn't. It never had been. One of the deputies stepped out of the cabin, holding a worn-out journal in gloved hands. "Belonged to Turner," the sheriff muttered, flipping through the brittle pages. "Last dated entry, 5 years ago." Danny didn't ask what it said. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. The investigation would take time. They'd search records, look for next of kin, try to understand what had happened here. But for Danny, the answers didn't really matter anymore. Because standing here, in the same wilderness that had swallowed a man whole, he saw himself. For years he had closed himself off, from people, from emotions, from anything that could remind him of what he'd lost. And yet these two dogs had slipped past his walls without him even realizing. The puppy, now strong enough to stumble over his boots, tug at his pant leg, whine for attention. The shepherd, always watching, always waiting, always understanding more than it should. Danny ran a hand over his face, exhaling deeply. Some things weren't meant to be found. But maybe this time, he hadn't just found them. Maybe they had found him, too. That night, after the police had left, Danny sat on his porch, a beer in one hand, the dog tag in the other. The shepherd lay beside him, head resting on its paws. For the first time since Danny had met it, the dog wasn't alert. Its ears weren't pricked. Its body wasn't tense. It was calm. Like it had finally, after all these years, finished what it had set out to do. Danny reached down, running his fingers through the thick fur behind the dog's ears. "Guess you can rest now," he murmured. The shepherd sighed. And for the first time Danny knew, it wasn't going anywhere. Either of them were. And maybe, that was the way it was always meant to be. Days passed, and the investigation confirmed what Danny already knew in his gut. Michael Turner never made it out of those woods. They found remnants of a camp deeper in the forest, signs that he had been injured, trapped. He had survived as long as he could, but eventually, the wilderness had taken him. The only thing that hadn't left was the shepherd. For 5 years, the dog had stayed, searching, waiting, holding on to something that no longer existed. But now, it had its closure. Danny watched as the shepherd stood at the edge of his porch one evening, staring out toward the trees. Was it going to leave? The thought hit harder than it should have. Danny cleared his throat, stepping up beside it. "You don't have to go, you know." The dog turned, eyes meeting his. That same deep, knowing look. A choice to make. The puppy tumbled forward from inside the cabin, wagging its tail, yipping at the shepherd. Danny watched as the older dog glanced between them, between the life it had known and the one it had now. Then, slowly, it stepped back onto the porch. Danny felt something in his chest loosen. "Yeah," he murmured, scratching behind its ear. You're home now. The shepherd sighed, settling beside him, and the puppy curled up between them. For the first time in years, Danny wasn't alone. And he knew, either were they. What do you think? Was the shepherd truly searching for its lost owner, or was it always meant to find someone new? Let me know in the comments below. If you love this heartwarming story of loyalty and fate, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more incredible dog stories. And if you've ever had a special bond with a dog, share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. Thanks for watching, and until next time.